Dr. Adrian Cole was experiencing the particular anxiety that comes from being the least important person at an extremely important event and not knowing where he was supposed to sit. The formal banquet aboard the Veyran Imperial starship Sovereign Dawn was in full swing, tables filling with diplomats, nobles, and officials from two civilizations trying to establish formal relations. And Adrian had been scanning the room for 10 minutes trying to identify an appropriate seat that wouldn't cause an interstellar incident. He was a cultural anthropologist. His job was literally understanding how societies organize themselves and communicate status through spatial arrangements and hierarchical positioning, which meant he understood exactly how catastrophic sitting in the wrong seat could be, and that understanding was currently making him sweat through his formal diplomatic attire. The Veyran Empire was one of the galaxy's established powers, ancient, sophisticated, and ruled by a royal family whose authority was both symbolic and absolute depending on context. The banquet hall reflected that sophistication, crystalline architecture that seemed to grow organically from the ship's structure, lighting that shifted subtly in response to ambient sound creating visual harmonies, seating arrangements that communicated complex political relationships through careful positioning. Adrian's problem was that his status was ambiguous. He wasn't senior enough to sit with Ambassador Chen and the primary diplomatic delegation at the high table where the Veyran royal family and their closest advisors would be seated. But he was too senior to sit with the technical staff and junior functionaries at the lower tables. He'd been briefed extensively on Veyran protocols, where you sat mattered, and seating yourself inappropriately was not a minor social mistake, but a potential statement about your understanding of political hierarchies. Most tables were filling rapidly. Adrian was running out of options and running out of time before his continued standing would itself become conspicuous and potentially insulting, suggesting either that he couldn't identify his proper place or that he was deliberately refusing to sit, both of which would be terrible. He was evaluating the relative risks of two remaining options when he felt a hand close around his wrist with surprising strength. He turned to find himself face to face with Princess Kurashin of House Veyran, third in line to the imperial throne, and someone whose briefing file had described her as formidable military strategist, accomplished scholar, and known for directness that other Veyrans find either refreshing or alarming depending on context. She was tall, most Veyrans were, easily 6 feet or more, with the distinctive features that made her species simultaneously beautiful and slightly intimidating to humans. Her skin had subtle iridescent quality, and the luminescent markings along her jawline and temples were currently displaying colors that Adrian's limited Veyran emotional literacy suggested meant determination or possibly annoyance. She had the bearing of someone trained since birth to command attention and expect obedience. "Sit here," she said, her voice carrying authority that made it very clear this was not a suggestion. She gestured to the seat directly beside her own at what was unmistakably the high table, the table where the Veyran royal family sat, along with the most senior human diplomats and their Veyran counterparts. Adrian's brain offered several responses, explained that there must be a mistake, suggest he wasn't important enough for that table, politely decline and find a more appropriate seat. His mouth, operating on the principle that refusing a direct order from alien royalty seemed like the fastest route to diplomatic disaster, said, "Yes, Your Highness, thank you." Her luminescent markings shifted to colors that might have been satisfaction or amusement. Adrian's briefing materials hadn't covered enough emotional nuances to be certain. She released his wrist and moved to her own seat with fluid grace that made walking look like choreography. Adrian settled into the chair beside her with the uncomfortable awareness that every eye in the banquet hall was now on him, trying to understand why a relatively junior cultural advisor had just been seated at the high table beside the princess. The other humans at the high table, Ambassador Chen and her two senior attachés were showing expressions ranging from surprise to concern. The Veyran nobles seated nearby displayed their own versions of confusion through shifting luminescent patterns. Princess Kurashin seemed completely unaffected by the attention she'd created. She arranged herself in her seat with precise movements, adjusted her formal robes, which were simultaneously modest and striking in ways that suggested centuries of royal fashion refinement, and turned her attention to the ceremonial speeches that were opening the banquet. Adrian tried to project confidence he absolutely didn't feel. He'd just been placed in one of the most politically significant seats in the room by direct order of a princess, whose motives he couldn't begin to guess. He was either about to become a minor footnote in successful human-Veyran diplomatic relations, or the center of a protocol incident that would be studied in diplomatic academies for decades. The formal speeches proceeded, welcomes in both human standard and Veyran, acknowledgments of the historic nature of formal relations, carefully worded expressions of mutual respect and interest in cooperation. Adrian paid attention with the part of his brain that wasn't frantically trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for his immediate future. When the speeches concluded and the meal began, Princess Kurashin turned to him with direct attention that made Adrian feel like he was being assessed for purposes he couldn't identify. "Dr. Adrian Cole," she said, clearly having done her research. "Human cultural anthropologist assigned to the diplomatic mission. You specialize in xenosocial structures and cross-species communication protocols. Your academic work on Veyran hierarchical organization was included in our cultural briefing materials. It was one of the few human analyses that demonstrated actual understanding rather than mere surface-level observation." "Thank you, Your Highness," Adrian managed, trying to sound professionally composed rather than deeply confused. "I'm honored that my work was useful." "You were uncertain where to sit," she continued, "and it wasn't a question. You evaluated multiple options, considered the political implications of each seating choice, and still had not decided when I intervened. Why the hesitation? Your analysis of Veyran social structures should have given you clear understanding of appropriate positioning." Adrian decided that Princess Kurashin's directness probably warranted honest responses. Understanding social structures theoretically is different from successfully navigating them in practice, Your Highness. I was trying not to cause a diplomatic incident through inappropriate seating choices. My official status is ambiguous enough that most available options could be misinterpreted. Sitting too high would suggest presumption. Sitting too low might indicate I didn't value the proceedings appropriately. And yet you accepted my directive to sit here, at the high table beside me, without argument or hesitation," she observed, her luminescent markings shifting to colors that Adrian thought might indicate curiosity or challenge. "That decision also carries risk of misinterpretation. Why did you comply immediately?" "Because refusing a direct order from Veyran royalty seemed like a faster route to diplomatic incident than accepting it, Your Highness," Adrian replied honestly. "And because I assumed you had reasons for the seating arrangement that superseded my concerns about status appropriateness." "An accurate assessment." She paused while servers delivered the first course, something that looked beautiful and probably required eating techniques Adrian would need to figure out quickly. "I ordered you to sit here for several reasons, Dr. Cole. First, I wanted to observe how you would respond to an unexpected directive from authority you don't technically answer to. Would you comply, argue, or attempt diplomatic deflection?" She took a bite of her food with movements that were so precise they looked rehearsed, though Adrian suspected this was just how Veyrans ate when they'd been trained in royal etiquette since childhood. "Second, I was curious whether you would prioritize your protocol concerns over direct royal command. That choice reveals much about how you evaluate competing obligations." "And third," Adrian asked, carefully attempting to eat his own food without embarrassing himself or the human species. Third, Princess Koreshan said, her luminescent markings shifting to warmer colors, I found your careful evaluation of seating options interesting. Most humans at these functions either claim the highest status seat available or defer entirely to Veyran guidance. You were attempting to navigate our hierarchy independently, which suggested actual understanding of our cultural values rather than mere protocol memorization. I appreciate that distinction, Your Highness, Adrian said. Though I should note that understanding a system and successfully operating within it aren't always the same thing. I was definitely struggling with practical application, despite theoretical knowledge. An honest admission of limitation. Her markings showed colors that Adrian was fairly certain indicated approval. Most beings would claim complete understanding rather than acknowledging uncertainty. Your honesty is refreshing. The meal continued with conversation that was simultaneously formal diplomatic exchange and something more personal. Princess Koreshan asked about his background, how he'd become interested in xenoanthropology, why he'd chosen to join diplomatic missions rather than pursue purely academic research, what he found most challenging about Veyran culture. Adrian answered honestly, finding that her directness made indirect diplomatic responses feel inappropriate. He talked about growing up on a multicultural colony world where understanding different social structures wasn't academic exercise but daily necessity. About choosing diplomatic service because he wanted to apply his cultural knowledge to practical bridge building between civilizations rather than just studying them from academic distance. About finding Veyran hierarchical systems simultaneously elegant and occasionally frustrating when trying to navigate them as an outsider. You find our hierarchies frustrating? Princess Koreshan asked, and Adrian couldn't tell if she was offended or intrigued by his admission. Not the hierarchies themselves, Your Highness. They serve important social functions and communicate information efficiently once you understand the system. The frustration comes from being an outsider trying to position myself appropriately when my status doesn't map cleanly onto Veyran categories. He paused. It's like trying to solve an equation when you're missing key variables. I understand the mathematical principles, but I don't have all the information needed to reach a correct solution. A reasonable analogy. She was quiet for a moment, and Adrian noticed her luminescent markings cycling through colors that suggested she was thinking carefully about something. Tell me, Dr. Cole, what is your assessment of my decision to seat you here? What social information is being communicated through this arrangement? Adrian considered this, aware that his answer would reveal how well he actually understood Veyran's social dynamics. Honestly, Your Highness, I'm not certain. The most obvious interpretation is that you're signaling that I, or perhaps the human delegation generally, hold higher status than our official positions might suggest. You're elevating a relatively junior member of our team to demonstrate that humans are valued guests worthy of proximity to royalty. A diplomatic interpretation, Koreshan observed. What other possibilities exist? You could be testing me, seeing how I handle unexpected elevation in status, and whether I can navigate the social complexity of being seated above my apparent station. Or you could be making a personal statement rather than a political one, choosing seating based on individual interest rather than purely hierarchical considerations. He met her eyes directly, which was probably bold but seemed appropriate given the conversation. Though I suspect attempting to determine which interpretation is correct without more information would be presumptuous. All three interpretations contain truth, she said, and her luminescent markings shifted to colors that Adrian thought might indicate satisfaction or approval. I am signaling that humans hold value beyond your official diplomatic status. I am testing whether you can adapt to unexpected social elevation with grace. And I am making a personal choice to sit beside someone I find intellectually interesting rather than accepting the seating arrangement that protocol would typically dictate. But, she continued, Veyran royal protocol grants me considerable latitude in personal choices, including seating arrangements at formal functions. I use that latitude to position you here because I wanted to assess you directly rather than relying solely on reports and observations from a distance. I'm honored by your interest, Your Highness, Adrian said, trying to sound professional despite growing awareness that this conversation had implications beyond simple cultural exchange. Though I should mention that having a princess's direct attention is somewhat intimidating for someone whose job usually involves observing from the margins, rather than being observed at the center. Intimidation is not my intention, Koreshan replied, though her slight smile suggested she wasn't entirely displeased by his admission. Though I am curious how you navigate that discomfort. Many beings become performative when they know they're being assessed. They present carefully constructed versions of themselves rather than authentic responses. You seem to be choosing honesty instead. Probably because I'm not skilled enough at diplomatic performance to maintain it under pressure, Adrian admitted. And because you've been direct enough that indirect responses seem inappropriate. It feels like you're asking genuine questions, rather than making diplomatic small talk, which makes genuine answers seem more appropriate than carefully crafted diplomatic statements. An astute observation about conversational dynamics. She turned her attention to the next course as it was served, but Adrian had the sense that she was still very much focused on him, even while performing the social ritual of eating. I am asking genuine questions, Dr. Cole. I have access to your professional evaluations and academic work. What I don't have is understanding of you as an individual beyond those formal contexts. That understanding interests me. They talked through the rest of the meal, about human and Veyran cultural differences, about the challenges of cross-species communication, about their respective roles in the diplomatic mission, and how they each viewed the developing relationship between their civilizations. Adrian found himself genuinely engaged in a way that transcended professional obligation. Princess Koreshan was brilliant, asked thoughtful questions that revealed she'd studied human culture extensively, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding him specifically rather than just gathering general information about humans. He also became increasingly aware that their extended conversation was drawing attention. Other guests, both human and Veyran, were watching their interaction with interest that ranged from curiosity to what might have been concern. Ambassador Chen caught his eye at one point, her expression mixing confusion and what might have been approval or possibly warning. Adrian couldn't quite tell. Princess Koreshan seemed either unaware of or unconcerned by the attention. When dessert was served and formal toasts began celebrating human-Veyran cooperation, she participated with appropriate solemnity, her luminescent markings displaying colors that suggested genuine hope for successful diplomatic relations. But when the official proceedings concluded and guests began standing, mingling, moving between tables for informal conversations, Princess Koreshan made another unexpected move. She stood, turned to Adrian with direct attention that made it clear this was a deliberate choice rather than casual gesture, and said clearly enough for nearby guests to hear. Dr. Cole, you will accompany me for a tour of the observation deck. I wish to continue our conversation about cultural practices and comparative social structures. It was phrased as a command, Veyran royal prerogative to direct others' actions. But Adrian caught the slight shift in her luminescent markings that suggested it was actually a question disguised as directive, giving him the option to decline while maintaining her royal bearing, and not requiring her to make what Veyran culture might consider an inappropriately direct personal request. I would be honored, Your Highness, Adrian replied, standing to follow her. As they left the banquet hall, Adrian noticed Ambassador Chen watching with an expression that definitely communicated, We are going to have a very long conversation about whatever this is." But she didn't intervene or object. Princess Kurashin led him through corridors that showcased Veyran engineering and aesthetic sensibilities, organic curves that suggested the ship had grown rather than been built, lighting that responded to their movement, materials that were simultaneously strong and beautiful in ways that made human construction look clumsy by comparison. The observation deck was spectacular, a transparent dome offering views of the planetary system they were orbiting, with a gas giant creating backdrop of swirling atmospheric colors that made the whole space feel like being inside a painting. They were alone. Princess Kurashin had either dismissed her guards or ordered them to maintain distance that allowed private conversation. She stood looking out at the view for a moment before speaking. "I should be direct about my intentions, as Veyran custom requires when personal interest develops," she said, still facing the viewport. "I ordered you to sit beside me at the banquet because I wanted to assess you personally rather than relying solely on reports and observations. You interest me, Dr. Cole. Your approach to cultural understanding, your honest acknowledgement of limitations, your willingness to navigate our protocols while maintaining your own perspective and dignity." She turned to face him, her luminescent markings showing colors that Adrian had learned indicated serious intent. "I am third in line to the Veyran throne. My choices regarding personal relationships carry political weight and are subject to intense scrutiny by both my family and the broader." Adrian's brain caught up with the implications of what Princess Kurashin was saying, while simultaneously trying to process the surreal reality of standing on an alien starship's observation deck, being informed that alien royalty found him interesting. "Your Highness, I need to make sure I'm understanding correctly. Are you saying that you're interested in me personally, in potentially romantic context?" "I am saying that I wish to determine whether such interest is warranted through further interaction," Kurashin corrected with characteristic Veyran precision. Veyran courtship protocols require explicit acknowledgement of potential interest, followed by formal evaluation period, where both parties assess compatibility through structured interactions. "I am formally acknowledging that I find you interesting enough to pursue evaluation of compatibility, and I am asking whether you would be willing to engage in that process," she continued. "This is highly irregular. Pursuing potential courtship with a human is unprecedented for Veyran royalty, and doing so during active diplomatic negotiations carries obvious risks of complicating political relationships between our civilizations. However, I am not one to allow political convenience to entirely dictate personal choices. I am informing you of my interest and asking whether you would be willing to participate in compatibility evaluation, despite the complexities involved." Adrian took a moment to organize his thoughts, very aware that his response would have implications beyond just this conversation. "Your Highness, I need to be honest about several things. First, I'm honored by your interest, and I'm definitely attracted to you both intellectually and physically. This conversation has been one of the most engaging I've had in years, and you're objectively striking by any measure." "Your attraction is noted and encouraging," Kurashin said with what might have been slight amusement in her luminescent patterns. "Continue." "Second, I'm concerned about the political implications. I'm a relatively junior member of the diplomatic mission. Any personal relationship with you could be perceived as creating conflicts of interest, or as being inappropriate given status differences, or as potentially compromising the diplomatic mission's objectives." "Valid concerns," she acknowledged, "though I should clarify that I am not proposing formal partnership at this stage, merely structured interaction to determine if such partnership would be appropriate and mutually desired. As for status differences, Veyran culture permits royalty considerable freedom in personal choices, provided those choices don't compromise our political obligations. And regarding diplomatic implications, careful management can minimize complications. Adrian nodded. Third, and probably most fundamentally, I have no idea how human-Veyran romantic relationships would even work given our physiological and cultural differences. I understand the theory of cross-species compatibility, but practical application seems like it would involve significant challenges that I'm not sure either of us is prepared to navigate. Princess Kurashin's luminescent markings shifted to colors that suggested both confidence and underlying nervousness. Apparently, even alien princesses got anxious about romantic propositions. She moved closer to where Adrian stood, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns of her markings and appreciate just how tall she was compared to human proportions. Regarding physiological compatibility, she said with the directness that seemed to characterize all her communications, Veyran and human biology is similar enough that physical intimacy is possible, though it requires communication, adaptation, and willingness to learn each other's responses. I have researched this question extensively. You researched whether human-Veyran physical intimacy was possible? Adrian asked, slightly amused despite the seriousness of the conversation. I am thorough in my planning, Kurashin replied without apparent embarrassment. When I began to find you interesting during preliminary research on the human diplomatic team, I investigated whether pursuing that interest was theoretically feasible. It is. The question is whether you're willing to engage in compatibility evaluation, despite the complications involved. She continued, as for cultural differences, your profession literally involves navigating cultural gaps and building understanding across species barriers. And I have spent significant time studying human customs, particularly regarding interpersonal relationships and romantic partnership formation. We would not be attempting this without relevant expertise and preparation. Adrian looked out at the gas giant's swirling atmosphere while he considered his response. This was probably a terrible idea. Getting romantically involved with alien royalty during diplomatic negotiations seemed like a fast track to career complications and potential diplomatic incidents. It was also incredibly tempting, because Princess Kurashin was brilliant, fascinating, direct in ways he found refreshing, and apparently interested in him for reasons that transcended political calculation or exotic curiosity. I'm willing to engage in compatibility evaluation, he said finally, though I should warn you that I have absolutely no experience with Veyran courtship protocols and will probably violate numerous customs through sheer ignorance of proper procedures. That is acceptable. Part of compatibility evaluation involves determining whether we can successfully navigate our cultural differences and teach each other our respective customs, Kurashin replied, her luminescent markings shifting to colors that definitely indicated satisfaction or pleasure. And I should warn you that Veyran courtship is formal and structured in ways that may seem rigid or overly systematic compared to human romantic practices. We don't typically engage in the kind of ambiguous, spontaneous relationship development that human cultural materials suggest is common in your species. What does Veyran courtship evaluation actually involve? Adrian asked. Scheduled interactions where we discuss specific compatibility criteria, values, life goals, personal preferences, approaches to conflict, expectations regarding partnership roles and responsibilities. Physical affection is minimal initially, progressing only as both parties explicitly agree to increased intimacy. The process typically takes several months, though adjustments can be made for unusual circumstances, such as limited timelines imposed by diplomatic mission schedules. She moved to seating area near the viewport, gesturing for Adrian to join her. We would meet regularly, perhaps 3 times per week, for structured conversations about compatibility factors. Between meetings, we would both consider what we've learned and whether continuing the evaluation serves our respective interests. At any point, Either party can withdraw from the process without social penalty or obligation to explain their reasoning. That sounds simultaneously intimidating and refreshingly clear compared to human dating ambiguity, Adrian observed, settling into the seat beside her. At least there's no confusion about intentions or mutual interest. Clarity is valued in Veyran culture, Koreshan agreed. We find the human tendency toward indirect communication and ambiguous relationship status to be inefficient and potentially hurtful to all parties involved. They spent the next hour discussing what compatibility evaluation would involve practically, when they would meet, what topics they would discuss, how they would navigate the social complexity of a princess conducting courtship evaluation with a human during active diplomatic negotiations. Koreshan was systematic in her planning, which Adrian found both slightly overwhelming and oddly comforting. At least, he would know exactly what to expect rather than trying to interpret ambiguous social signals across species barriers. I should also inform you, Koreshan added toward the end of their discussion, that if our evaluation progresses beyond initial stages, my family will need to be notified. Not because my choices require parental permission. I am adult and autonomous in my decisions, but because family awareness and support is culturally significant in Veyran courtship practices. So if this works out, I'll eventually be meeting your parents for the "is this human appropriate for our daughter" conversation. Adrian asked with slight amusement. Eventually, yes. Though I suspect my mother will be more concerned about diplomatic implications and political complications than about species differences. She is pragmatic about personal relationships provided they don't compromise political obligations or family standing. They returned to the banquet hall separately. Koreshan first, Adrian following several minutes later to avoid creating appearance that they'd been conducting private meetings away from official diplomatic contexts. But as Adrian rejoined the human delegation, he caught her eye across the room, and her luminescent markings showed colors that he was learning to interpret as anticipation mixed with satisfaction. Ambassador Chen cornered him immediately. Cole, what exactly just happened? The princess seats you at the high table, monopolizes your conversation during the entire meal, then takes you for private tour of the ship. I need to understand if this is diplomatic development or personal situation that might affect our mission. Both, honestly, Adrian admitted. The princess has expressed personal interest in me and has invited me to participate in formal Veyran compatibility evaluation, essentially their version of courtship. I've agreed. I'm reporting this to you because it could have diplomatic implications, but I should clarify that this is primarily personal rather than political. Ambassador Chen processed this with the expression of someone whose diplomatic mission just became significantly more complicated. All right, this is unprecedented, but potentially useful if managed carefully. Keep me informed of developments, maintain appropriate professional boundaries in official contexts, and for the love of everything, don't cause an interstellar incident through romantic complications. I'll do my best, Adrian replied. Though I should note that Veyran courtship is apparently very formal and structured, so hopefully the protocols will actually minimize rather than maximize potential for incidents. Let's hope so, Chen said. Because explaining to Earth's diplomatic corps that our cultural anthropologist is dating alien royalty is going to be interesting enough without adding, and it caused a diplomatic crisis, to the report. The next 3 weeks involved a strange hybrid of continuing diplomatic mission work and formal Veyran courtship evaluation. Adrian attended negotiation sessions, provided cultural analysis, helped draft language for proposed cooperation agreements, all while also having scheduled 3 times weekly meetings with Princess Koreshan, where they systematically discussed compatibility criteria with thoroughness that would make academic peer review look casual. They talked about values, what they considered most important in life, how they approached ethical dilemmas, what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. Adrian learned that Kurashin was deeply committed to using her royal position to advance Veyran society through strategic reform rather than maintaining tradition for its own sake. She learned that Adrian believed cultural understanding was fundamental to building peaceful interspecies relations, and that he'd chosen diplomatic service specifically to apply that belief practically. They discussed life goals and expectations. Kurashin was candid about her royal obligations. She would eventually need to assume significant political responsibilities, would be expected to marry in ways that strengthened political alliances, and would have limited freedom in some aspects of her life, regardless of personal preferences. Adrian was honest about his career ambitions. He wanted to continue doing cultural research and diplomatic work, wasn't particularly interested in accumulating power or status, and valued intellectual stimulation and genuine connections over material success. Your goals and my obligations are not necessarily incompatible, Kurashin observed during one of their evaluation sessions. Royal partnership does not require abandoning personal interests. It requires balancing them with political responsibilities. Your work as cultural anthropologist could actually complement my political role by providing insights that pure political analysis would miss. Assuming we get that far, Adrian noted, we're still in evaluation stage. Either of us could decide this isn't working and withdraw from the process. True, though current indicators suggest we are compatible in significant ways. Her luminescent markings showed colors that Adrian had learned meant contentment or satisfaction. Our values align well, our approaches to challenges are complementary rather than conflicting, and our conversations remain engaging rather than becoming routine. They also discovered areas requiring negotiation and compromise. Adrian's tendency toward informal communication sometimes clashed with Kurashin's preference for explicit, direct statements. Her systematic approach to problems occasionally frustrated his more intuitive, creative problem-solving style. They had different relationships with hierarchy and authority. She was comfortable with the structure and expectations that came with her royal position, while he preferred more egalitarian social arrangements. But they navigated these differences with the same systematic approach they'd applied to everything else about their courtship evaluation. When communication styles conflicted, they explicitly discussed preferences and established protocols for how they would signal when directness was needed versus when informal interaction was acceptable. When their problem-solving approaches diverged, they learned to appreciate how each perspective enhanced the other rather than competing. Physical attraction, when they finally progressed to evaluating that dimension of compatibility, turned out to be thoroughly mutual despite species differences. Veyran courtship protocols dictated that physical affection progressed gradually. First, non-intimate touch like hand-holding or shoulder contact, then more intimate but still clothed physical closeness, eventually progressing to actual physical intimacy only after both parties had explicitly confirmed their interest and comfort. Adrian found the systematic progression both slightly awkward. Having to explicitly negotiate each stage of physical contact felt unromantic compared to human spontaneity, and also reassuring, because there was never ambiguity about consent or comfort levels. When they did finally progress to actual physical intimacy, after 5 weeks of evaluation and systematic progression through earlier stages, it involved both awkwardness and genuine pleasure in discovering each other. Veyran and human anatomy was similar enough that intimacy was possible with communication and adaptation, different enough that the process involved learning responses and preferences that didn't map directly onto what either of them had experienced before. You are remarkably adaptable, Kurashin observed afterward, her luminescent markings showing colors that Adrian now recognized as contentment mixed with affection. Many beings become frustrated with the need to learn completely new physical responses and preferences. You approached it with the same intellectual curiosity you apply to cultural understanding. It's not that different from cultural translation, Adrian replied, tracing patterns along her arm where her markings were showing particularly vibrant colors. Paying attention to signals, adapting based on responses, learning what works rather than assuming previous experience translates directly. An apt comparison. She shifted closer, which was interesting because Veyran's apparently enjoyed physical closeness after intimacy in ways that were similar to human cuddling. I am pleased with how our evaluation is progressing. Current evidence suggests we are compatible in ways that would support long-term partnership. Does that mean you're ready to move beyond evaluation to formal courtship? Adrian asked. It means I'm ready to inform my family of our courtship and begin the process of securing their support, which is required before formal partnership can be established. Her markings shifted to colors that suggested some anxiety mixed with determination. That conversation will likely be complicated given the unprecedented nature of human Veyran royal courtship. The conversation with her family, conducted via secure transmission since they were still aboard the diplomatic ship rather than on the Veyran homeworld, was indeed complicated. Her mother, Empress Shuravel, was surprisingly pragmatic about the species difference, but deeply concerned about diplomatic implications. Her father, Prince Consort Velnar, was more worried about whether Adrian understood the constraints and expectations that came with marrying into Veyran royalty. Her older siblings were mixed in their responses, some supportive, some skeptical about whether cross-species partnership could work given cultural differences, all concerned about political ramifications and conservative faction responses. But Kurashin navigated the family discussion with the same systematic approach she'd applied to their courtship evaluation, presenting evidence of their compatibility, addressing concerns directly, and making clear that while she valued family support, she was ultimately making her own choice about her personal relationships. The formal announcement of their courtship, required by Veyran protocol once family had been informed, created predictable controversy. Conservative Veyran factions questioned whether royal partnership with a human was appropriate or would compromise Veyran political interests. Some human diplomatic observers worried about whether Adrian's relationship with Princess Kurashin would affect his objectivity in cultural analysis or create conflicts of interest in diplomatic negotiations. But they faced the complications together, having built foundation of genuine compatibility through systematic evaluation that proved their differences were navigable and their connection worth the effort required to maintain it across species barriers. The story concludes months later, with Adrian and Kurashin's courtship having progressed to formal partnership acknowledged by both Veyran royal family and human diplomatic leadership. They're navigating the complex intersection of his work as cultural anthropologist and her role as Veyran royal, finding that their relationship actually enhances rather than compromises their respective professional contributions. Why did you really grab my wrist that day at the banquet? Adrian asks during a quiet moment in their shared quarters aboard the Sovereign Dawn. What made you choose me specifically? Because you were carefully evaluating where you belonged rather than presuming status or deferring entirely to others' judgment, Kurashin replies, her luminescent markings showing colors he now easily reads as fondness and contentment. That balance of confidence and humility suggested both intelligence and appropriate self-awareness, qualities I value highly. She continues, and because I wanted to see how you would respond to unexpected direction from authority you didn't technically answer to. Your immediate compliance while maintaining your dignity suggested adaptability and trust, also valuable qualities in potential partnership. So it was a test from the very beginning. It was an opportunity to observe your character in circumstances you couldn't prepare for, she corrects. And you passed by being honest, flexible, and willing to trust my judgment while maintaining your own perspective and autonomy. Those qualities made you worth pursuing despite every political reason. I should have maintained appropriate distance. The human cultural anthropologist and the Veyran princess, brought together by a seized wrist and a commanded seat, building partnership through systematic compatibility evaluation that proved love could transcend species barriers when both parties committed to understanding each other's differences while valuing what made each unique. The small moment of her grabbing his wrist and ordering, "Sit here," became symbolic of their entire